These next two examples, we are going to talk about half-angle identities. So we are trying to find an exact value for cosine of pi over 8. Pi over 8, I don't even know what it is. I don't know what the reference angle is, so I'm not worried about it. So our normal 30, 60, 90 triangles, our special triangles, is not helpful. So instead, we have these half-angle formulas. So cosine of a over 2. So this is kind of what we're going to try to create, is this formula. Sine is this formula. Tangent actually has these three. So if I were to probably pick one, I'd probably try that one. Seems a little bit easier. Bad news is that typically you're given a cosine value, so you'd have to do a little bit extra work to figure out what the sine is. But so we're going to try to find cosine of pi over 8. So it's a little bit tricky. One way to kind of figure this out, like what angle are we going to try to do here, is take this piece of a over 2 and set it equal to the angle we have. So if you solve for a, you're going to multiply by 2, and so a is going to equal, that's going to cancel with that, so that's going to be pi over 4. Okay, so what that allows you to do is we rewrite. So cosine of, here's a kind of a messier way to write it. A is pi over 4 over the 2 is one way to look at it. So that's your A, which basically allows us to just plug it right into this. And so we'll talk about this plus or minus piece here in a second. So we will get a plus or minus square root of 1 plus cosine of A, which is pi over 4, which just so happens to be a value we can do, divided by 2. So cosine of pi over 4 is referring to a 45, 45, 90 right triangle. So cosine is 1 over root 2, which rationalizes to a root 2 over 2. So plus or minus the square root of 1 plus root 2 over 2 over 2. All right, so that is a mess. So we got one little nice trick that will clean all this up. And it's the fact that we have a square root within a square root. And that too is part of the square root in the denominator. Is the bigger problem that we have is we have this fraction mixed within fractions. And there's one thing we can do that will very, very quickly take care of that. And that is whatever your denominator is, we're going to multiply every single piece by that denominator. So as long as we multiply it to everything, we haven't broken any of the math rules. So it does a pretty cool thing for us, is it makes this 2, and it cancels the denominator away here, so it's just a plus root 2 over 4. So then I have a plus or minus, and now I can kind of treat these separate, where it's 2 plus root 2 over root 4. And it kind of guarantees, because this is pretty common that this kind of a thing happens, and so because even if you have a pi over 3 or a pi over 6, you'll have a root 3 over 2, or you'll have a 1/2, and you can multiply everything by 2 every single time, and it'll make a 4 in the denominator, which will multiply out very, very nicely. So this plus minus is the last thing we got to deal with. So the top is kind of this weird square root within a square root, and then it's divided by 2. So this plus minus, we have to figure out what quadrant we're in. So based on the original thing, a pi over 8 is less than a pi over 4, so pi over 4 is 45. So we're definitely in the first quadrant. So pi over 8 is quadrant 1, and quadrant 1 for cosine is positive. So our answer is going to be the positive of this. So it's all dependent upon where that angle sits, is where you're going to have these pluses or minuses going on. All right, so it's very just dependent on the problem. Okay, so let's do one more. We'll do number 2. So number 2, we're going to figure out what sine of 195 degrees is. So 195 degrees is not something that I'm familiar with. So I'm going to go back to writing this as a over 2. It's going to equal 195 multiplied by 2. And a is going to be, if I double 195, that's going to be 390. Okay, so if I rewrite this, we're looking at sine of 390 over 2 is how I'm trying to write that. Okay, so my a value is 390. So we're going to be doing this formula. So 195 degrees, let's just kind of figure out what quadrant we got going on right away. 195 is somewhere down here, right? So we're looking to do sine in that quadrant. So as soon as we start to write our plus and minus, our formula here, so 1 minus cosine, because the formula is always cosine on theirs, of 390 degrees divided by 2. We got to figure out whether it's plus or minus. Well, sine is negative for 195 degrees, so our final answer is going to have a negative sitting on it. All right, so 390 degrees is kind of our next thing. Cosine of 390 degrees is all the way around and 30 more degrees. So we are looking at doing cosine of 30 degrees. So I write my basic 30, 60, 90. And cosine of 30 degrees is root 3 over 2. So this is going to be a negative because of the quadrant that we end up being in. 1 minus root 3 over 2 over 2. So we have the same problem as before. We'll multiply each piece by 2 to clear out that fraction specifically. And then we get a negative 2 minus root 3 over 4. That's going to square root into 2. And then the top, there's nothing we're going to be able to do with that. And that is the exact value of sine of 195. And if you're not quite sure about it, type that into a calculator, and you should get the exact same thing.